In 1969, Penguin Books brought out one of its most successful anthologies, Children of Albion, edited by Michael Horowitz. It sold an astounding 105,000 copies in its first print run. Unfortunately, Penguin decided, for reasons unknown, not to reprint it, which is a great tragedy. I was very privileged and fortunate to be included in it. How I came to be included in it is just one of those things that happened in the 60s, and it certainly wouldn't happen today. And Penguin publish virtually nothing, I think, in poetry, except perhaps the collected poems of Geoffrey Hill. I'm not even sure about that. How I came to be in it was one day I saw an advert in the New Statesman from a man called Alan Tarling, who has sadly died, and he ran a hand press called Poet and Printer Press, and the wording of the advert was along the lines of, "Tomorrow's Larkin or Lowell, send your manuscript to me." He wasn't a phony, and he wasn't a vanity publisher, and a few months later my first collection of poems, The Quarrel with Ourselves, was actually published. And again I had a great stroke of luck in that John Carey, who recently retired as Professor of Poetry of English at Oxford, reviewed it favourably in the New Statesman. This came to the eyes of Michael Horowitz, who put me into Orphans of Albion, Children of Albion, sorry. And clearly, looking at this 45 years later, some names are very famous. Roy Fisher, Ian Hamilton Finlay, Anthony Crozier, and most of all I think probably Adrian Mitchell, who sadly died 2 years ago. I'd just begun to write to him, and then the next thing I knew was that he had sadly died. There are voices that should have lasted. Some of the poets have sadly died, some no longer appear to be writing, but I was very, very fortunate to be in it. The most important poem in it was Adrian Mitchell's poem about Vietnam, To Whom It May Concern. The first verse: "I was run over by the truth one day. Ever since the accident I've walked this way, so stick my legs in plaster, tell me lies about Vietnam." Somewhere, probably on YouTube, there is a recording of Adrian Mitchell reading that himself, and it's marvellous to hear it in his own voice. Some things work out in life, some don't. And sadly, Alan Tarling began extremely well. He published a pamphlet of Ted Hughes, Scapegoats and Rabies, which is included in Hughes' collected poems. He published Christopher Logue's Establishment Songs. He published a brief anthology called Three Regional Voices, which included Ian Crichton Smith, who represented Scotland, Michael Longley, who represented Northern Ireland, and myself, I represented the north of England. Strangely, Alan Tarling never reprinted this. He did a few hundred copies, and when he ceased publishing in 1999, he said that he'd been asked for 5,000 reprint copies, and he refused to print one. Quite why he did this, I just don't know. Clearly, financial success was not what he was after, and it is now quite a rare collection. It says on the front 3 shillings, which shows just how long ago this was actually published. Michael Horowitz said he was determined to publish an updated version called Children of Albion Revisited, but he never actually did this. I did question him about this, and sadly, although he'd been very enthusiastic at one point, he said it was no longer one of his priorities. What I was able to do, with the help of a grant from the Arts Council, which was obtained by Simon Jenner of Survivors Press, I was able to edit a book called Orphans of Albion, Poetry of the British Underground. When I actually came to actually working out who I should include in it, I realised over the decades the underground of British poetry had changed considerably. Strangely, there were poets who, like Brenda Williams, have never received the recognition they should have received, but there were also very well-known poets, including the former poet laureate C. Day Lewis, whose work somehow has fallen away from the establishment canon. Quite why, I don't know, but I find, looking through Orphans of Albion, a considerable number of poets who were part of that establishment. What is the difference between poetry and underground poetry? I think basically it's a very simple one, that mainstream poetry is published by mainstream publishers. Of course, there are now very few who publish poetry. Faber, Bloodaxe, Carcanet, really those three, and occasionally Jonathan Cape. Those are the only names remaining. Oxford University Press stopped publishing poetry some years ago. There are obviously a plethora of small presses which stay about for a few years and then disappear because there's no more funding available, and this is very sad. And with the dropping of print in favour of the internet, the physical production of poetry has declined considerably. Still, I'm very pleased to say that the number of there weren't a huge number of copies printed, but Dr. Simon Jenner of Survivors Poetry has told me he is hoping to reprint this book later this year. It is a very strange mixture. I include Michael Haslam, who was one of the Cambridge School. I include Kevin Crossley Holland, who used to be a very important editor, and then he made a huge success of writing historical novels, and now I gather he spends his life travelling across America giving readings. There are also poets again who have kept some kind of fame, but not the kind of fame they actually deserved, particularly James Simmons. Sadly, he died 12 years ago, very shortly after I'd begun to correspond with him, and he is a very important poet, and he is significantly omitted from all the kind of anthologies that you would expect him to be in, and there is no collected poems. You have to get the individual volumes and put them together. I also included one poem by Philip Hobsbawm, who of course was very famous as the originator of the group, and then when he moved to Belfast, he then restarted the group with very well-known poets such as Seamus Heaney and Michael Longley. I once wrote to Hobsbawm, he died in 2005, saying why hadn't he published his autobiography, and it clearly got out of touch with the reality of publishing. He said, well, no one will pay me to do it, but the truth is, in poetry and in this kind of writing, nobody will pay anyone to do anything. Very little, very few pounds. I'm very pleased with having the ability to include poets in here, and particularly the opening of Day Lewis's poem, birthday poem for Thomas Hardy. Is it birthday weather for you, dear soul? Is it fine your way, with tall moon daisies alight and the mole busy, and elegant hares at play by meadow paths where once you would stroll in the flush of day? I fancy the beasts and flowers there, beguiled by a visitation that casts no shadow, a friend whose mild inquisitive glance lights with compassion beyond the tomb on all of this wild and humbled creation. It's hard to believe a spirit could die of such a generous glow, or to doubt that somewhere a bird-sharp eye still broods on the capers of men below. A stern voice asks the immortals why they should plague us so. Dear poet, wherever you are I greet you. Much irony, wrong, innocence you'd find here to tease or entreat you, and many the fate fires have tempered strong, but none that in ripeness of soul could meet you, or magic of song. I think that is an incredibly beautiful poem. I haven't read it all, but it is there, and it's there for all to see and to enjoy. It is strange how Day-Lewis has departed from the pantheon, and it is very sad because he was a truly important, if at the end minor poet, but nonetheless he was a very important poet. One thing he did was to foster the talent of John Silkin, a Gregory Fellow in Poetry at Leeds University, who too has died without, I think, collected poems. I've heard that there is someone writing his biography, but they themselves are very ill, and it's unlikely that the biography will ever actually be completed. Some of these characters I've included in my novel Pitfall Street. One of them is the late Peter Redgrove, and you may know that a biography of Redgrove has been published recently. I read it 2 or 3 times, and I think the problem is that it was written by an over-enthusiastic follower of Peter Redgrove, who was blind to his weaknesses as a poet and his weaknesses as a person. I knew Redgrove reasonably well. I met him dozens of times when he was Gregory Fellow in Poetry at Leeds. He was very striking when you first met him. It was in Geyser Town Hall I first heard him read, and I entered this room full of people in wet raincoats, and there was a huge fog of cigarette smoke and pipe smoke, and suddenly the other end of the room somebody rose in the air. It was Peter Redgrove, and he said very dramatically, "A tree in a storm is like a brain in a brainstorm." It was incredibly dramatic, and I was drawn in by Redgrove's persona. He taught me quite a bit. He took one of my early poems and said, "Poetry begins where your poem ends." It was a dreadful poem about my love of ballet, but he was right, and somehow that shock, like a sudden jolt of electricity, started me writing seriously, something which I've done now for nearly 50 years. I got a great deal out of it, not obviously in the sense of financial gain, because poetry makes no money for anybody, unless you happen to be a poet laureate, and I have had a success which is very strange. In the United States, first one website called Famous Poems and Poets requested all my poems, and then 4 other websites took them on, and I think all but one have a Share It on Facebook Now page, and this is a very strange place to gain success, but that is how the world works. How many people have seen my poems, I've no idea, but I'm preceded by Rabindranath Tagore and followed by Francis Thompson, the author of The City of Dreadful Night. And it's brought great pleasure to me, now I'm 71, to see that my poems have been are available to anyone in the world in this rather strange way. And my collected poems is still in print and hopefully will remain in print, and my selected poems is in print and will remain in print. And now I'm able, thanks to the kindness of Brenda Williams, to record some of my poems for YouTube, and hopefully they will be there forever, or certainly for a very long time.